Joel Selvin, author and critic who lives with a slightly feral cat in a huge collection of books and music in San Francisco. And we're going to talk about books and music in San Francisco, I guess. So yes, the collection is mind-boggling that you have here. And one of the reasons is, as I understood, is that you basically get sent everything.
Yeah, I didn't buy all these things, so that, you know, at least I have that to offer in my own defense. But yeah, some time ago, I realized that I had this accumulation, and I needed to embrace it, or it would just overwhelm me. So yeah, I live in a library.
Are you ever pruning something? Are you ever going through all of this and look at things and say, yeah, maybe you are going to go in a box, or you are going to be somewhere here on a pedestal?
I remember going through the albums at one point quite a long time ago for the first time. Let's just see like what, and I had 11 albums by Dave Mason.
Unbelievable.
I mean, how many Dave Mason albums do you really need in a library?
Yeah, I have one.
There's a good one. There's one good one. And then there you could have a greatest hits too. Mm-hmm. And then if you were really aberrant, you could keep the Mama Cass Dave Mason duet album, because that's just a strange album. You won't listen to it, but you know, it is like at least keepable.
Okay.
But the other
and what happened to the other 7?
Yeah, I mean, what am I doing? I've lost my mind. 11 Dave Mason albums.
I've also brought someone with me, or rather he brought me with him, because I'm only a novice in all of this, and Werner is probably like a kid in a candy store here looking at your collection and talking about memories that you both share and bands. And yeah, there are probably a lot of anecdotes and a lot of weird things happening over your career. You mentioned that you once were thrown out of a club where you were to criticize the concert and things like that.
Nightlife in San Francisco in the 80s before AIDS was the Wild West. I mean, there were clubs where the bartenders would sell you quarter grams right across the bar, and the town boogie woogied all night long, and the nightlife is treacherous.
And ambulances.
Oh, you know, all the bad things that can happen to you in life, most of them happen at night. Then also,
all the best things.
All the best things also happen at night. So,
has San Francisco become more tame since then?
I wouldn't know. Yeah, probably. It certainly never recovered from AIDS. Overnight, a third of the audience was missing at the nightclubs, at the restaurants, just like overnight. They just stopped going out. They didn't all die. Eventually, a large number of them did, but right away it was like terror gripped their lives, and they were not in a party mood anymore.
Yeah, a wave of fear.
And it's not just that a third of the people weren't there. These were the sparks. These were the guys. These were the party starters. These were the people that made San Francisco the wild and crazy place it was. And suddenly it was like, whoa, very quiet. And it only emerged from that with the advent of the multimedias, you know, the .coms, and those kids began to like flood San Francisco's nightlife in the 90s, mid-late 90s, and they were a different bunch. They were super serious. They didn't leave work until 10 o'clock at night. They went to the strangest restaurants and encouraged the worst kind of gastronomy, and then they weren't interested in original music. They were interested in ironic
waves.
music. So they wanted to see like, new wave band that did all hits of the 80s, or a disco band that just did disco music, something that had some kind of theme. And nightclubs responded immediately to that, and boom, that was the end of the original music scene in San Francisco. You wonder why there hasn't been a band since Green Day that came out of here that anybody noticed.
But are there still the old joints and places running, like
Not so much.
the saloon, who seem to be
The saloon's managed it.
unsinkable?
Yeah, the saloon. Yeah, it's life and death in 3/4 time over there. I don't know why that's still there, but it is, and it's been a bucket of blood for 100 years.
Yeah, it's like City Lights bookstore or Vesuvio's.
There's like little spots like that, but it's just not the way it was.
Yeah.
There's no blues bands playing on Grand Avenue anymore. There's no little dive bars where you can walk in and hear someone just blow your mind. It's been a long time since that's been out there. But not in the recent distant past. I remember Robert Plant coming to town, and he wanted to play blues. He wanted to sit in with some blues band, and his manager got a hold of me, and we went out to dinner. It was a lovely evening, and then we just went up to Grand Avenue, and like there were 2 or 3 clubs, and we walked in the second one. And the band was on the stage. I still remember like negotiating the door. There were 7 of us, and the guy wanted $3 a piece, and I kept pointing behind me. I go, $3, look at who. And he goes, and he kept counting. 7, like, all right, here's your $20 or whatever it was. And when we went in, the only people that were in the part where the band was playing were the band's girlfriends. But the band knew who it was that walked in. They're like, and they finished their number, and they don't play again. Yeah, no, because Plant and his guys took over. And now, like all from Grand Avenue, the word is out. Before Plant's finished his first number, now the place is packed. There's like 50, 60 people in there, like inside 3 minutes. Whoa, man, that was fun. That was the sort of night, that was North Beach, the way I remember North Beach from, coming onto the scene and being part of the nightlife, and running into everybody at the hamburger stand Clown Alley at 2 in the morning when the bars closed. And it's like, here's Mayor Brown, here's Dragomir, the head waiter from the fancy restaurant up the street, and here's Bill Cosby. And it's like, everybody's been dumped out on the street to have a cheeseburger because they're too drunk to go home.
One reason we're definitely here is Cipollina, because Werner is a huge fan, and you had a story about meeting Cipollina.
No, that wasn't.
Recently.
That was the last time I saw John.
Yeah.
And it was just a few months before he died.
Mm.
Backstage at a club called Chi-Chi Theater. Very punky, new wave type place, like out of that movie Desperately Seeking Susan. And it was where punk rock bands went to die. And I don't know what Cipollina's band was that night. I don't remember Gravenitis being there. So maybe
Might be Zero.
Yeah, or I don't know. What is Zero?
Wasn't Zero.
No, it was some like minor. But there he's going to go out and play in front of like 15, 20 people, and we're backstage smoking a joint and talking. And I knew he was sick and had emphysema. So a little surprised that he's smoking a joint, but well, they come and tell him it's time to go to stage. He goes, and he reaches behind him and he pulls out a walker. I'm like, holy shit, John. And he gets up on his walker and he picks up his guitar and he slings it over his shoulder, and he reaches down to his pack and he pulls out a pack of Lucky Strikes, and he shakes it until he gets one and puts the pack back. Puts the Lucky Strike in his mouth, lights it up, and
then he goes with a walker.
And the last time I saw Chip was him with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, a guitar over his shoulder, taking a walker to the stage. And at that time, I just looked at that one. Wow, that is so rock and roll. Whoa.
And he was probably 45 years old. at that time.
He was dead within 3 months.
Yeah,
It was very close.
He died in May 89.
Way young. So always sickly. It was part of his
Sick child
thing
Yeah.
was that, you know, he was a sickly, wan guy that girls always had to take care of. And always had things for him that would make him better. You know.
Yeah, because they could make him better.
You know, that was part of the hippie thing, you know.
If it worked for him.
But I also heard
Never heard
that
for company.
Nick said he was talking girls to death when he took them home. He was.
There were lots of them. I know that. You know, I mean, lots of them made babies with him. I mean, Cipollina was a cowboy.
Absolutely, and when he was in Germany and he had a concert in Bonn and all our girlfriends were with us, and he was with you called it Nick Silver in the US, we called it the Gravenitis Cipollina Band, and with Marcus David from Clover on drums, and Alster Haley from Spirit on bass, and all our girlfriends lined up next to him below stage and were admiring him. So we got envious.
Cipollina did a lot of European work because he was useless here. He couldn't make any money here.
Yes.
So he spent a lot of time in Italy, Germany,
Greece,
England.
where,
That's when he started
stands for-
associating with that Welsh band, Man.
Yes, I did the book from Dick Leonard on his Rhinos, Winos and Lunatics. You surely have it yourself, and that's where they did a tribute song when Chip died, and that starts with House Full of Comics.
Yeah, and that was.
They were huge fans.
Oh, it was a wonderful. It was the best thing he did after Quicksilver.
Yeah, when he played the Roundhouse in '75, just his
I'm thinking they did.
long fingers.
I'm thinking they
crawl.
did it over here.
Really?
I'm thinking that I saw this.
Yep.
I don't know if I'm making that up or not, but I'm remembering
No,
seeing Man
It's right.
at Keystone Berkeley.
Yeah, yes, that's true. Leonard told me about that. That they toured the West Coast and especially the Bay Area, and teamed up with John. But I think the record was.
The record was later.
Well, yeah, that was live, and that was, I think,
In England.
In England.
Yeah, and it was a German record company.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it wasn't even an English record company.
Yes, because it was Line Records in.
That's right.
And
Yeah, it's like so many of the San Francisco hippie bands just flunked out in the early '70s. Like a Country Joe and the Fish,
Yes.
just was nobody cared. But there was life after death in Europe.
Yeah. Same with the punk bands or the
Country Joe-
garage bands.
Country Joe's manager became expert at Eastern European record deals. And the Grateful Dead remember him to this day for coming up with money from Eastern European record deals when they were broke and couldn't get a dime. And then
that
Belmont
true?
would come in with these $5,000 record deals from Hungary.
Yeah, this is out of this world.
Especially at a time where it wasn't international, the music distribution, where it really was going there and meeting people.
You had to know who to call, you had to know what, I mean, everything was different. There was no midem, there was,
All networking.
no, it was precious information.
another thing is I have a background in science fiction, as I already mentioned, and for me the connection between science fiction and fantasy and rock music was very interesting. I was the first in Germany to write about this topic, and back then in say 1971 or so, names came up like Pink Floyd, who had read science fiction themselves as well. You could read it from the titles of the songs they use, like Interstellar, Overdrive, A Saucer Full of Secrets and stuff. So I began to research into that direction. Where does it stem from? Is it just the sound of the electric guitar that's futuristic? The image, you know, in the early days of the instrumental bands, we had the Shadows, the Ventures.
Is there a question in there?
Oh, it's interesting.
Yeah, it's a long question.
Very long question.
You know, I'm famous for my long questions. They tend to be something different.
He's famous for losing his way halfway through.
Well, you're right.
I'm a
of course.
noodler.
There's this territory, and I've never really given it much thought, between science fiction and rock. There are a lot of those connections, and the Kantner is a huge obvious example of that. Wooden Ships is science fiction, right?
Yes. And David Crosby and
Crosby was a co-author on that too. But Kantner in particular was the influence. You know, Have You Seen the Saucers? And then Blows Against the Empire and all that's very science fiction and it's purposefully so.
Yeah, with a friend of mine, I edited practically the first book anthology on rock science fiction stories, and that was for Kantner, that was for Hendrix. You know, everybody thought Purple Haze was some sort of acid. Actually not. It is from a short story by Philip Jose Farmer.
Really?
Yes. And the most intriguing thing for me is that the American or the worldwide fanzine and later magazine scene in rock and roll stemmed from science fiction fans. We already mentioned Paul Williams with Crawdaddy on the East Coast.
Well, the science fiction was prevalent theme in the counterculture of the early '60s. You know, everybody read Strangers in the Strange Land.
Yes, Pigpen had a Beretta in one hand and Ray Bradbury collection in the other. Yeah,
no, it was definitely a theme. It never really it wasn't one I intersected with in particular, but yeah, it was always a theme. You know, I hadn't thought Pink Floyd.
Lenny Kaye came from the science fiction scene. Greg Shaw with Mojo Navigation.
Well, no, like I said, anybody who was reading and writing in those days dabbled in science fiction because the underground was a very small little stream.
Yes,
and you know there was a vast mainstream culture, and it was oppressive. It was very dialed in. There were 3 television channels, and the programming was for the lowest common denominator. And literature was parceled out by an educational establishment that had very Catholic views about how this would be. So there was this tiny little stream that ran pretty much from college town to college town. And there were little elements that fed into it. Civil rights movement, poetry, jazz,
lyrics, and my
science fiction was one of those streams. There's no question. And I can when I think back to 1965 in Berkeley, right across the street from the north gate to the campus was a bookstore called UC Corner, and they sold magazines and paperback books, because in those days paperbacks were pocket-sized books, and they were bargains, and new bookstores didn't really trade in those. They traded in the expensive heavy ones. So this was a paperback bookstore, really kind of a glorified magazine stand. But they were catering to this Berkeley underground. So it was linked up with similar establishments in like Greenwich Village in New York City, or West Hollywood, or Soho, or in London, and Madison, Wisconsin, and Austin, Texas. Funny little outposts of this underground culture.
Islands.
They were all associated with universities, even if often the people weren't college students matriculating, which is certainly the case in San Francisco in '65 when all that stuff started to happen.
Palo Alto, Stanford.
Palo Alto, Stanford. Those were just a bundle of little streams. Like, for instance, I did this book about the San Francisco music scene called Summer of Love, and I interviewed a couple hundred musicians that had been involved in San Francisco in the '60s, and almost all of them came to San Francisco. Right? There weren't that big a contingency of people who grew up here. Some, but the vast majority came here from somewhere, and every single one. I don't mean every single one. I mean 100%. I mean everybody I talked to, when I said, "Why did you come here?" They said the same thing. Because I read On the Road by Jack Kerouac.
So this one book brought the scene.
Well, that book was a cornerstone of this kind of underground culture I'm talking about. May have been like the first sort of gaseous cloud coalescing. And when it was published, it created this mythic journey with San Francisco as the destination. And San Francisco was painted in these mythic terms from this underground vantage point. And everybody who read this book was stung by it. It's like how they say about the Velvet Underground, only 1,000 people bought the record, but every one of them started a band.
I did.
Jack Kerouac, was not a bestseller, but everybody who read it, it changed their lives.
And they all came here, and they all found a valve.
A vast number of them came here, yeah. And they came here to live a beatnik life.
Yeah.
And his protagonist driver became a legend in San Francisco himself.
Neil Cassidy is the link between Kerouac and the Grateful Dead, and Ken Kesey and all that. He was the Dean Moriarty in On the Road.
Yeah.
And he was for real the driver.
Oh yeah, he's a real guy.
Yeah.
I used to see him walking around downtown San Francisco carrying a sledgehammer.
He drove
a sledgehammer?
Mm-hmm. He drove the
Doing what?
Twirling around.
Okay.
It was just an accessory to his fashion.
I show you videos on YouTube.
Yeah, you're going
you won't believe.
We wanted to talk about another intersection of music and literature, about authors playing music, because you're also part of a band as an author.
That was Kathy Goldmark. And you can't explain Kathy Goldmark. She was just somebody who had free access to her wells of creativity. Her profession was media escort. And that meant that when authors came through town to do book tours, she would pick them up at the airport and take them to their appointments. So over the course of a year, she would get to meet a couple hundred authors. And Kathy was a musician who believed everybody had musical talent and that everybody should enjoy playing music. And she used to have a band, played a lot of country stuff. I used to tell her it was the only live karaoke band in the business, because she was always, "Oh, you got to come up and sing." "I don't sing." "Oh, come on, And so she collected all this information about people's musical habits. And it occurred to her that a lot of these authors had musical abilities. And so she started to suggest that a band might be a good idea of all her favorite authors. And I know Dave Barry and Amy Tan were in right away. And she started collecting other people. She got the Rock Creek Dave Marsh, and Dave knew Steve King, and Stephen King went, "Hell yeah." And suddenly we had this thing. I mean, Stephen King was just a fantastic performer, And he had appeal. I mean, people would pay to see us because Steve King was going to sing rock songs. I mean, it was just nuts. And there were a lot of other people in the band who had, serious careers in the book business. And Kathy just was a friend of mine. I didn't qualify, but I jumped at the chance to be in the chorus with Roy Blunt and Matt Groening and Dave Marsh and Grio Marcus. And yeah, I'm in. Count me in. And we wrote a book and, used the advance to fund this tour. So we did like a East Coast tour, bus and plane and all that crazy stuff. Pretending we were a rock band, and the audiences were going along with it. So it was quite the thing. And Kathy died a few years ago after a long, hard battle with cancer. And I want to tell you what kind of person she was, because at the end she was in the hospital, surrounded by friends, and it was a Sunday, and she was expected to go. So they're passing around cell phones, and people are singing to her from across the country, and by Monday morning, she's still there. Not so much, but she's still there, and a few of her friends are still there, and she sits up laughing, just giggling, and she had this infectious laugh. I wasn't there, but this was described to me, and I know how she was. And and then she settled back into her bed, and she's just laughing, she's giggling, and her husband comes over and says, "What are you doing?" "What?" And she looks at him and says, "Rosebud."
Oh no.
Seriously. Okay.
And then she died.
That is the ultimate fun way to go.
Yeah. The ultimate exit.
Wow.
That is so profound and so deep, yet so appealing. I mean, it was, as Kathy Goldmark, I mean, she blew us all away while she was alive, but that one just like sealed the deal.
It's a little hard to veer back from that, but I just picked out a few of the names you mentioned, and so now Steve King is actually a good vocalist. I knew that he
knows 5,000 songs.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he has a Danny Farrington acoustic guitar with spiders on the neck, and he'll sit in the bus and go, "Hey, remember this one?" and play "Hey, Western Union Man." I'm like, what songs don't you know? He knows like 5,000 songs, and he has what one reviewer described as a kind of Frankenstein-like presence on stage, which is like he's kind of awkward and oafish, but
bulky.
He's enthusiastic and he's funny and he communicates. And Dave Barry, who's like this really outgoing, extroverted guy, could really work up Steve, and the two of them were hilarious together. So Steve was doing a version of Teen Angel, which is some old 50s rock song about a guy's girlfriend getting killed in a car crash, and it's very macabre. And,
lovely.
And in Steve's version, the guy goes back in the car not to get the ring, which is what the guy does in the song. He goes back to get the vial of crack. And we all thought this was funny, and it was all loose and everything, and he dissembled the whole song. Whoa! We get a letter from the lawyers representing the music publishers of Teen Angel, an esteemed Nashville firm called Acuff Rose. And Acuff Rose tells us that they don't want to hear about any more deviations from their copyright, or they're going to have our butts in a sling. This is just not beyond. This is, everybody's so happy. You know, I mean, you couldn't have asked for anything better for these guys than a letter like that. And it's like 2 or 3 nights later that we're actually playing in Nashville in front of a sold-out nightclub, which I'm sure contained members of people who were in the employ of Acuff Rose in that audience. And Dave Barry goes out there with this letter, and he says, look, he says, we're going to do a song now, but I want to tell you that there's this music publisher, and we've heard from them, and like he goes, now, when I say Acuff Rose, I don't want you guys to think assholes, okay? Acuff Rose. And the audience yells back, assholes! And that's where we just started with this. And I mean, he was like in the middle of the song, leaning into the mic, going, Acuff Rose! And the assholes! We didn't hear from Acuff Rose again after that.
Just wanted to ask if there ever was another letter.
Oh, no.
They didn't want to mess with
No, that wasn't a bad idea. That was a weird, freaky night. Some girl set her fingernails on fire for Steve that night.
Her fingernails?
Yeah, and it set her fingernails on fire and held them up in front of the stage.
Oh, yeah, fire starter. Now I get it.
Yeah.
But what does Matt Groening do?
What did he play?
He was in the Critics Chorus with Roy Blunt, Dave Marsh, Greil Marcus, and yours truly. Now,
the Critics Chorus.
We were like the background vocalists, and I think we had a couple of numbers that we sort of mangled ourselves. But I mean, Matt always wore a different T-shirt from his vast collection of bootleg Simpson T-shirts.
He collects bootleg Simpsons.
Yeah, he has all the bootlegs. And if he was signing autographs for people he thought were going to resell them, he misspelled his name. Matt was great.